Chuck Morse, Left Right Radio, Monday through Friday, 12 noon. My guests are Dan Kennedy, Melissa Zimdars. Dan is a professor at Northeastern University, the Department of Communications. He's also the author, and I'll point the book out. It's the book, The Return of the Moguls.
By the way, Chuck, that's the School of Journalism. The Department of Communications are our arch rivals.
Thank you. Okay, I want to be very clear here. And Melissa Zimdars is a professor at where is that? Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Merrimack College. She's the author of the article, My Fake News List Went Viral, but made up stories are only part of the problem. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the phenomena of fake news, but before we go there, Dan, I just want to do a quick recap of your book. We've talked about it before. It's a great book. You talk about how the big media moguls, and there's been apparently some more additional moguls recently who have signed on to buying the great old print news media outlets. In your case, you focus particularly of interest here in John Henry at the Boston Globe and at Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post. Now, in a nutshell, do you think that these great moguls, and of course, big media has a history of that, but coming in now, I mean, are they maintaining the media so it doesn't go under, as it were? Because after all, they have had major hits in recent decades. Or are they reinventing it? Are they innovating it?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on which mogul you're talking about. I think at the Washington Post in particular, Jeff Bezos, by taking the Post national and going almost entirely digital, really is reinventing what a national newspaper can do and be. And the Post is growing, the newsroom has grown, and they claim to have been profitable each of the last 2 years. So you're seeing some real innovation and growth at the Post. What we've seen with John Henry at the Globe is more of a matter of maintaining a business that he still has not really figured out the answer for yet. And when I say maintaining, it has continued to shrink under John Henry. But I think fortunately for people who depend on the Globe, it has shrunk a lot less than it would under some of these hedge fund owners, such as Digital First or Gatehouse Media.
And I would argue, and Melissa, you make this point in your article as well, that these big media behemoths in the big cities, the big old print media, they no longer have, even if they are more than surviving under the big infusion of cash brought in by the moguls, they no longer have that sort of cultural centrality that they once had. I mean, the Boston Globe is a good example of that. I mean, yeah, I've always been a lifelong resident of the area. I've always both loved and hated the Globe, like I think a lot of Bostonians. But I always looked to the Globe as kind of a barometer of what's happening in my city. And I don't really do that as much now. I still read it, but I don't think it has that kind of central position any longer. And I would say probably to degrees, you could say that about all the big city papers. Why is that? Is it because of the influx of all these new medias, or what's going on with that? Melissa?
Well, I mean, I guess what I see, so still this imperative of profit. So that might mean covering things because other newspapers are covering them and just reporting on that. It might mean simplistic coverage. Political news is terrible. So we don't need every day a different poll when we're 9 months out from an election happening. And so I think, the Boston Globe, I have a love-hate relationship with the Globe. I have friends who write for the Globe, but I not so recently canceled my subscription. I still have 3 newspaper subscriptions, but that's not one currently. So I think it's a mix of problems. But what I'm even more concerned about is the number of cities that are in danger of not even having daily newspapers. They're being bought out. Their margins are decreasing. Advertising revenue is declining. And so I think what you have is a perfect storm. You have more news sources, alternative and mainstream, that people can access for free. That doesn't necessarily mean they're better, but you couple that with funding issues and a lot of concentration and conglomeration of ownership. And I think you see a decline in quality in a lot of places. And that leads to, people distrusting news or not being as connected or covered by it.
And it seems like in the old days when I was growing up, you had just the big, maybe one or two print outlets. You also had the big three on the network. You had Walter Cronkite sit up there sanctimoniously telling us every night, that's the way it is. And you really didn't have much alternative. I mean, he almost determined how it is. And of course, Douglas Brinkley in his biography of Cronkite kind of let the fact out of the bag about how liberal he was. But so, it was sort of in our time now, we have so much more diversity of sources and of media. We have, I think it's almost 300 outlets between cable and on radio. You've got Sirius XM. You've got all sorts of talk access. Print media, not so much, but yet nevertheless, you have, a great deal more competition. It's almost like going back to the days of the 19th century when in a big city like Boston, you had 20 odd different newspapers all competing with each other. I mean, I would think that that's a good thing. At the same time, I also miss that central voice, whether you like it or not. What do you say, Dan?
Well, I mean, we used to say that the Globe was the 800-pound gorilla. It's still the 400-pound gorilla. There isn't any other media organization in Boston that can drive the conversation quite like the Globe can. What worries me in Boston and nationally, probably more nationally, is you talk about this great increase in competition. The competition is essentially among opinionated media outlets that don't do a whole lot of original reporting, among news organizations that are dedicated to doing fact-based reporting. There not only isn't more competition than there used to be, there's less competition than there used to be. And not only that, we see efforts to discredit these fact-based news organizations as being just more voices within the partisan conversation, which really isn't true. But by creating the sense that it's true, we have a delegitimization of mainstream news sources and a sense that, Breitbart is just the conservative equivalent to the New York Times, which is just an absurd proposition, but it's one that we've seen President Trump and people around him try to propagate. And it's one of the ways that he's been able to create his own information universe, which I think is a pretty dangerous thing.
But it seems to me that the reportage, the establishment media, maybe it's a phenomenon that's happened just in the past couple of years, like some people on my side of the fence might say with the election of Trump, or maybe it's something that's been going on maybe over the past decade or so. But the line between factual reporting and editorializing has become more blurred. And I think that has a lot to do with the, not demise, but diminution of these big media outlets. They have become more associated as liberal mouthpieces because they are, to a certain extent. And it's not that they are openly, like Breitbart is openly conservative or the HuffPo is openly liberal. They don't claim to be objective. They do have ideological orientation, even though I think both of those do some pretty good reporting. But we're talking about, the way the Globe or the New York Times covers things. It's become more ideological, and I think that has hurt them.
Could you give me an example, Chuck?
You too. Thank you for asking. And these are minor examples, but they're typical of.
Can you give us some major examples?
Well, they're minor but they are major in that they are the type of reporting that happens every day. Andrea Mitchell from NBC News. Now, I know this is television. This was a couple of weeks ago. It was a minor comment, but it was typical of what I'm hearing a lot more. She referred to Juanita Broderick, who was accused former President Bill Clinton of rape. she referred to this as, quote, discredited. And when Juanita Broderick's lawyer, who also happens to be her son, contacted NBC News and asked, what is the source of that? How did she come up with this? Who did this, quote, discrediting? The response from NBC News was to edit it out of the site and remove it, kind of airbrush it off of her comments. The other example I'll give is the Supreme Court decision, the master cake decision, they call it, with the baker who didn't want to make a cake with symbols of gay marriage on it. And that's something, it's a separate issue. I don't agree with that. That's not the point. The point is that it was reported by, I think it was CNN, as a, quote, narrow decision. It wasn't a narrow decision. I mean, a narrow decision would be 5-4.
That's not what they meant by a narrow decision, Chuck.
What did they? But it was a 6-2.
No, that's not what they meant by a narrow decision. What they meant was that the court, and good judges always try to do this. The court decided the issue on peripheral grounds. They did not go after the heart of the issue. That's what CNN meant by a narrow decision.
So it wasn't because it was a 6-2 decision.
No.
All right, but even, and I accept
How about, I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Chuck. What do you think of the New York Times' generations-long obsession with the Clintons, culminating in its bizarre, over-the-top coverage of Hillary Clinton's alleged email problems, which probably did as much as anything to cost her the election? Was that a matter of liberal media bias?
Well, are you talking, and by the way, I commend the New York Times for one piece they did in March of 2015, when they exposed the business of the uranium purchase and how Hillary Clinton's Secretary of State gave a green light to that. That led to a lot of research amongst conservatives. And, you do make the point that they did cover that. I don't know if it was a bizarre thing. But are you saying that the email story was not really a real story? I mean, it seems to me that it was.
Well, I'm going to shut up for a moment. Melissa, go for it.
I think what I'm hearing is, or based on the research I've been wading through in a book I'm working on, a lot of what we think of as bias depends on our own perceptions and beliefs. So you might look at the New York Times or Boston Globe as being liberally biased, but I look at them as having a corporate bias or a bias towards maintaining the status quo in who's in power. So we perceive different kinds of bias based on whether or not we might agree with what's being reported, but that doesn't mean that they're not striving for balance or neutrality or objectivity, which comes with its own set of issues. But I think part of the problem with these perceptions of bias, besides alternative media really fostering that as a central concern for which they are speaking back to, is the fact that so many of us are coming across these bits of news on social media. And on social media, up until very recently, a headline wouldn't necessarily be marked as an opinion piece. And so you would see that, read it as opinionated news. And I think that was part of the problem. So the presentation wasn't making it clear that it was opinion. And you can connect that in cable television. It's almost never clear when it's news or punditry. And so I think that line is blurred across the board, which only feeds into these perceptions of bias.
I think that you are right in that the mainstream media has a corporate bias. I suppose, look, these are all corporations. I mean, America is made up of corporations, privately owned companies, and whether they were incorporated or not. And also, they generally tend to be somewhat patriotic. I mean, we are going to give a pro-America slight bent to the media. I mean, we don't have to report, this isn't, far right-wing or far left-wing, kind of attack on government. We're not going to have that in the mainstream media. And I think that's a kind of a consensus. But I'm talking about here generally a liberal bias, which is fine, by the way. I mean, it goes back. I remember how Reagan was covered. I remember how George W. Bush was covered, especially in his last years. But I think it's reached the point now where it has become more hardened to the point where there's a little bit more of a license to cross the line and really shade a story in the area of what you hope is reportage.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I don't.
Okay.
I mean, I think that the coverage of President Trump has been overwhelmingly negative. There's no question about that. But, we have a major chicken and egg situation here. I mean, I would suggest that the reason that coverage of President Trump has been overwhelmingly negative is because he has been overwhelmingly terrible as president.
Okay, but it reaches a point of irresponsibility when it fans the flames of division. Like, for example, this constant meme of referring to President Trump as having something against minorities.
Where would people ever get that idea? My God.
I think it's because they parse every word he says, and then they hold it up. They broaden the microscope by saying anybody who supports him, therefore, must have something against minorities. And I don't think that's true. And I think that it's divisive, and it's not new. It's gone on. I mean, we could look back at other Republican candidates, and they said similar things.
No, they didn't.
It's become such that I think it's creating real division in the society, and it's not the best way to go. And I get that there's a bias there, but it's just I don't know. It's a nasty way to go about things, and I don't think it's working either, because apparently, according to a recent poll, I can't cite the source of the poll, President Trump's approval ratings among particularly African American men has gone up to about 18 to 20%. And now Hispanics, it's bumped up as well. So, it's not, I mean, it's this attempt to try to, I think, attack Trump for reasons that really aren't related to that. There's policy reasons why I think liberals don't like him, but they're using this as the main strategy of trying to denounce him and what he's trying to do.
But I think when you reference policy, that's one of the problems with how politicians and government officials are covered. So analyses of news coverage of both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton before the election showed almost complete lack of coverage of their policies. And that's partially because Trump didn't really have any, and still doesn't, besides tweet proclamations, which shouldn't be a stand-in for policy. And so I think, just rewinding us a little bit, that's the problem that I see, is a bias toward covering who is winning this particular poll, which group is approving more or less on any given day, rather than really digging into what they stand for, their records. All of that is much more important. I think that's missing, partially because it's more complicated to cover. It costs more money to cover, and it might not be as catchy of a headline on social media. So I don't know.
That's right. And I mean, we generally cover politics the way we cover sports. Who's up, down, who's ahead, who's behind. And what we've really seen in recent years, when we were talking about the fading of the mainstream media, one of the most important and influential of the new big mainstream media players is the website Politico, which I think has, if anything, driven sports-type coverage of politics to new extremes and pushed news organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times in a direction of doing more of the same thing in order to keep up with Politico. Politico's slogan was always "Win the day," and their entire orientation is toward dominating the political conversation of any particular day. And there are many, many things we could point to that has had a terrible effect on political coverage in this country. But I think the way Politico covers politics is one of them.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, it's like a horse race. They look at, which nose is ahead today, and there's not a lot of instruction about what, there's not much nuance there. I mean, there's not a lot of analysis in the real sense. As far as Trump having an agenda, I think he did have a very clear agenda. Now, it might not have been detailed with lots of papers, but he put out a simple idea, one that seems almost weird in that who would be against it, and yet I think it set off a firestorm among liberals, and that is the idea of putting America first, securing America's borders, economic nationalism. I mean, making better trade deals with foreign powers, cutting back on American foreign aid, particularly to NATO and military aid, not getting involved in interventions as much. These things are real, and he's actually going forward with them to varying degrees. And I think that's why I think liberals, and I'm not saying this because I'm putting on a tin hat or something, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just a tendency that I have observed, why they sort of changed the subject and talked about, he doesn't like black people or this sort of thing. Because they didn't want to address those issues, because they were fearful that they could lose on an argument like that.
Chuck, let me ask you a question. I'm not going to say that you're not a thinking conservative, but why do most thinking conservatives dislike Trump every bit as much as liberals?
Why do they dislike him?
Yeah.
I think that as a person, he's he has a lot of problems. I mean, he's a bore. I mean, in many ways, and I think that liberals tend to not trust. I mean, conservatives. I'm sorry, we don't tend to trust government, and that includes our own. I mean, it's sort of a suspicious feeling that we're afraid he's going to sell out, or he's not going to hold up to our values. I mean, today everyone is concerned in conservative circles that he's going to cave and appoint a more liberal Supreme Court judge. And so there's kind of a vigilance in terms of the way we watch Trump. I don't think it's that we don't, we have hopes for him, but we're afraid that he's going to buckle under, because he has some major flaws, I think, in his personality. He tends to gravitate toward, the personal and what feels right. In a way, he has a similar personality, I think, in that way to Bill Clinton. So, conservatives tend to distrust government. And yet I think that it's a little different with liberals, where I think there's much more of a cult orientation in the way they follow their leaders, whether it be Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or whomever. And so, it's not that we dislike, it's that we don't trust. We want to verify, we want to watch, and we have high hopes.
I mean, I disagree with a lot of what you're saying in terms of the broad characterizations. That's okay. But I think you bring up the point of distrust. And I think that, and I mean, if we think about Donald Trump in relation to news and fake news, one of the critiques that is that you could levy against him is the way he actively delegitimizes the press, not because something is biased or incorrect, but because he disagrees with it, or he knows strategically if he undermines it that his cult of followers may be more likely to also discredit it. And so when we think about the contemporary news environment and trust and bias and what allows fake news to spread, when you have people like Donald Trump consistently characterizing traditional news orgs that way, this is partially the result that we're seeing now.
Do you feel concerned that, I've heard some people in liberal punditry say that they feel that he might somehow compromise, the freedom of the press, and that he might, because of his constant comments about fake news, which I tend to agree with you. It's very self-serving. I think that most presidents have done it to varying degrees, but with Trump, it's much more ugly and it's more open. He doesn't have surrogates go out and do it. He tends to do it himself. But either way, it is a little unsettling, I think, in that I wonder if he might start to put a brake on actual freedom of the press.
Trump to date actually has done very little. And when you compared him to some of the actions that President Obama and the second President Bush did, it's really rather mild. Under Obama, there were multiple leak investigations that resulted in reporters being ordered to give up their confidential sources. Right. In one case, James Risen of the New York Times went a number of years thinking that he might end up having to go to prison to protect his sources. With President Bush, after the New York Times exposed a secret wiretapping program by the National Security Agency, which was arguably an illegal program, there were people within the Bush White House, including his then Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, who said that the Times ought to be prosecuted under the Espionage Act, the World War I era law. And of course, we can't. We could talk all day about the real threats that Richard Nixon made against the press. With President Trump, it so far has been mainly rhetorical. But I think that the threat that he's making is, and Melissa, this is exactly what Melissa was driving at. The threat he's making, I think, in some ways is less. It's less of a formal threat and more of a pernicious discrediting of the mainstream media, so that he wants us to reach a point where there's no longer any agreed upon set of facts that we can work off of, which is really absolutely essential to governing ourselves in a democracy. And if he's I mean, this trend was already there, but I think it's really accelerated under Trump, where everybody just has their own set of facts. And you instantly are just, oh, well, you read that in the New York Times, so it's instantly discredited because it was in the New York Times. And I think that's the kind of thinking that he's encouraged. And I really do believe it's incredibly dangerous, even though there's no specific legal threat against the press.
Well, I think a lot of President Trump's claims about fake news, and again, I will acknowledge that it's self-serving. I mean, anything that doesn't agree with him, he'll wave a hand and say fake news. But nevertheless, a lot of his focus has been on this Russia probe, which I think has been reported very unfairly and very dishonestly by the mainstream media. They have not talked at all about many aspects of it, which are troubling, like this phony dossier and the FISA spying and some of these other things that you really can only get that information from people like Sean Hannity or Breitbart. And it's virtually a blackout. My liberal friends who know nothing about this.
I know all about it, and it's been discredited.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, we could argue that, but the point is it's not a balanced understanding of this situation. It's if you listen to people like Rachel Maddow or just some of these other MSNBC, it's just I get the fact that they have their side and that they're openly one-sided, but it borders into the area of a dishonest approach to a very important issue. It's not giving us nuance or perhaps a broader understanding of what this is all about or what's really going on. So you have a polarization. You could come out and say, oh, well, this is all, garbage. And I could say the other side, but maybe that's the very manifestation of what I'm talking about. We don't have a nuanced understanding of this issue.
I don't think Sean Hannity is a news source.
No, he's not. He's an opinion source, but he is covering. He's one of the few people covering this FISA story. That's why I bring him up.
And I think that actually, to me, demonstrates something, that if there's only one person in this info glut saying something, that usually signals something to me. And I read like National Review and other conservative news sources that I might not ideologically agree with, but at least they're based in a shared sense of reality. And even they have discredited some of what you're saying, what Sean Hannity keeps propagating. And so I think, we can critique the mainstream coverage of these issues, but I also wouldn't hold up Hannity as a good counterweight to that. He's demonstrably false on so many topics.
I looked him up this morning because a friend of mine said, Sean Hannity lies a lot. And I found in like Snopes and some of these other sites that he has made wrong statements over time, not just on this issue, but going way back. But at the same time, look, he's held under a microscope, him and I would say previously Rush Limbaugh, in that you have these guys like at Media Matters, they look at every single word he says. And, he's on the air for 4 hours and yeah, he makes mistakes, but I would wonder why that same standard isn't applied to maybe more liberal talkers like Rachel Maddow. I think if we held her under the same standard, we'd find that she's made mistakes too. Now, whether or not he deliberately, consciously lies, I don't know about that, but sure, you could look to a lot of mistakes.
Well, there are conservative organizations that try to do exactly what Media Matters does to the right. Why aren't you aware of Rachel Maddow's lies, Chuck? Maybe she doesn't lie.
I think that the conservative, are you talking about Bozell's group? I don't know. I mean, they do some of that work. It doesn't get
that's all they do.
Yeah, but it doesn't get the same amount of coverage that the other side gets.
I'm well aware of it.
You're in the media, but your average person who just gets the 6 o'clock news and watches, the mainstream, they don't hear that because it's not covered as much, as maybe the other side is. So
Sean Hannity has the highest rated cable talk show in the country. Actually, maybe Tucker Carlson does. I don't know. Why aren't they putting forth what the Media Research Council is finding night after night after night? Apparently, they're not.
Well, again, it's an opinion show. It's not. This isn't hard news. But
so we don't want any facts.
No. But the hard news shows don't do, I think, an even job of looking at the opinion outlets from both sides. And when we're talking here about fake news, so-called, and it's my contention that the bias of the partisanship has become more pronounced in recent years to the point where it borders on fake news. And I would mention this most recent story, and that is the business of separating families and the immigration. Terrible policy. I am glad that President Trump has signed an executive order ending it. I'd like to see the families reunited as soon as possible. But the way this thing was covered was so inflammatory. I mean, I talk about Buchenwald and, Dachau, and, you had people comparing it to, Japanese internment. And it created such an amount of rage, I think, in polarization. I just don't think that's responsible journalism.
Well, I mean, I think the policy created that polarization.
Which had been in place since Bill Clinton.
No, it hadn't.
No, that has been proven false.
No, the Flores decision of 1998, as an appeals court judge said that they would have to separate the children because the children, for humane reasons, because the children couldn't, I don't agree with it, but so the children couldn't be held with the parents if they came into the country illegally.
But it wasn't happening.
It wasn't happening as much because President Trump in April of this year went to a zero tolerance policy. So that increased it.
Correct.
But the point is, it was happening, and it's a very complicated question. And the way it was covered not only lacked nuance, but it was directed as a way to demonize President Trump. And it created, I think, a great deal of unnecessary discord. It could have been, if it was just a little bit more broadly and honestly covered, maybe we could have accomplished more, because that's what the media should do. That's what our journalists should do. Expose a more objective look at a situation so there can be real reform.
And I think, I would critique almost every recent president's immigration policies. And even under Obama, there was a lot of things that I disagreed with.
Absolutely.
So I'm not saying Trump is necessarily an aberration in this, but it was his policy. This was shown repeatedly. In fact, Jeff Sessions even talked about developing it. National Review even credited this administration with this policy. And I think a lot of the hysteria generated from this policy was, when, news organizations like ProPublica started really talking to people and documenting what was happening. And once that happens and once people are seeing it, it's hard to contain. And yes, it's unfortunate that most of us have not been paying attention to this issue for a really long time. But it's also suspect that Trump's administration implemented this when border crossings are actually lower than they were even 10 years ago. So it's again, a pretty messed up system. And I don't agree with all of the coverage, but at least I want to determine that.
Chris Wallace just interviewed Jay Johnson, who was President Obama's Homeland Security Director, and he said that they'd been doing this back then. So, and again, I wouldn't be happy with it back then. I just wonder why now all of a sudden this is becoming, and the virulence of it is becoming so pronounced.
Because the Obama White House's policy was to target illegal immigrants who were criminal suspects. So you had a much lower number of kids who were being separated from their parents, very low compared to what is going on now. What's going on now is so extensive and broad-based that the Trump White House apparently has no idea how to reunite these kids with their families. This could go on for months.
I know they can't really find them. And by the way, I think that I'm very critical of Trump for essentially deputizing ICE agents and allowing them to deport people, whereas in the past they didn't do that. I think that's wrong. And I think that, but again, I mean, it should be covered in a way that takes out some, just saying to lower the temperature a little bit and take out some of this hyperbole where these things are used as a broad way to try to not just attack Trump in a reasonable way, but to really go after him in a way that I think is unprecedented. I mean, we probably agree on a lot of these actual issues. My contention is that the tone of it in this time is such that it has bled into a blurring of the lines between reporting and opinion making, which I suppose to a degree is inevitable, but it's become much more pronounced, I guess. Anyways.
I would agree with you to this extent. I think that some of the outlets, especially nationally, have had to target who their audience is. And I think that the New York Times has decided that their audience is a national and international liberal audience. And it doesn't mean that I think that their stories are suffused with liberal bias every day, but it does mean that they're targeting the overall product toward this audience. And you see it in their story selection. You see it in the types of things they cover, and to some extent, the types of things they don't cover. And I think the Washington Post strategy in recent years has really been to target it's not so much a liberal bias, they're targeting that anti-Trump audience. And I think they've done that pretty extensively. Look, I admire what the Washington Post has done in a lot of ways. And yet there are times that I just find it exhausting to read because it's Trump, 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 Trump. And I find myself switching back to the Times for a few days because it's not quite as much Trump. You do learn about other things.
But when it is about Trump, it is usually not too nice. Michael Smerconish is a very well-respected radio talk show host in Philadelphia. He's been on the air for about 25 years. He likes to call himself a centrist. He maybe slightly left of center. You know, very honest. He's a lawyer. He's a straight shooter. I listen to him often. And I heard him the other day say that he had recently made some mildly positive, praiseworthy comments about something that President Trump had done. And I don't exactly remember what it was. And the hate mail that he got, the threats he got, the rage that he experienced, threats to boycott his advertisers, all this stuff. You know, it's like, it's a reflection of what's going on. I mean, I think he went back onto the reservation after that. I mean, it's just, at least from my observation. So maybe that goes to what you're saying, Dan, with regard to how the media is essentially catering to their audience.
What did he say?
That I don't know. He was talking about it. So I didn't actually hear it.
Okay.
But he said it was a mild thing. He just said, I think that President Trump did this. This was a good idea. No big deal. It wasn't it was a minor, almost aside on his part. But the reaction was explosive.
Well, I mean, I once wrote an entire column saying that President Trump was correct to try to get rid of the rule that says nonprofits, including churches, can't engage in political speech. Mm-hmm. And nobody tried to drive me off the air.
That's interesting. You mean the Johnson Amendment?
Yeah, the Johnson Amendment.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'm glad you did that, Dan. Anyway, we're kind of wrapping it up here, so I want you to, Dan, talk a little bit more about your book.
Okay. Well, thank you. I would be happy to do that, of course. You mentioned there may be other moguls arriving on the scene. We did see a wonderful development, potentially wonderful development, just within the last few weeks, where Dr. Patrick Song-Shoon, a billionaire surgeon, finally got permission to buy the Los Angeles Times and the San Diego Union Tribune. And he seems to be in the same mold as Jeff Bezos and John Henry. He is promising to try to expand coverage. He brought in an excellent editor, Norman Pearlstein, who's kind of a legend in our field. And so, there's another newspaper that I think, at least for the time being, is in the hands of a good steward. What I worry about is that I think that there are papers out there that could operate on more or less a break-even basis and are just being driven into the ground by terrible corporate ownership that's trying to squeeze out the last few drops of blood before shutting them down. And I know that you have a national show, Chuck, but we're all kind of local here in the Boston area. Mm-hmm. The one that I worry about the most is Digital First Media, which is controlled by a hedge fund, Alden Global Capital, and locally it owns the Lowell Sun, the Fitchburg Sentinel, and Enterprise, and for just the past few months, the Boston Herald. Would you care to guess what Digital First profit margin was on its Massachusetts papers in 2017? Any idea?
I have no idea.
26%.
Wow.
26% profit. Okay. Nationally, Digital First owns about 100 papers. Their profit margin in 2017 was 17%. Wow. Now, those kinds of profit margins were incompatible with good journalism, even when there was money in the business. Mm-hmm. Now that the business is really suffering, in order to get those kinds of profit margins, you're killing the press. And as much as the newspaper business is being kind of overwhelmed by problems such as technological change, cultural change, the collapse of value in digital advertising, I think that greedy corporate ownership is at least as much of a problem. And what I really hope we're seeing, to bring it back around to my book, The Return of the Moguls, is more wealthy, philanthropically minded people getting involved in buying newspapers and not operating them at a loss, but trying to figure out the business problems so that they can break even or become somewhat profitable, as all of the great papers were in the past. And I don't mean print. I think that papers are going to be either predominantly or entirely digital. But I do think that their survival as large institutions that cover a wide variety of different types of news is absolutely crucial to our democracy.
Well, Dan, just to clarify, how is it? I mean, it seems like somewhat of a contradiction in terms. How can these corporate investors make a better profit and at the same time hurt journalism? I would think that they'd want to encourage good journalism. I mean, they're selling a product, and that's journalism. I mean, why is it that it works out that way?
I think that what you're seeing with a few of these owners, and again, I would say that Digital First is probably the most notorious example of that these days, is that they have decided that these newspapers have entered their final years, and if you can keep cutting ahead of the decline in revenue, you can turn out some pretty good profits for a few more years. And when you have run through that process, you either shut down the paper or you see if there might be some local people willing to buy the shell of this newspaper to see if they can do something with it. And it's a very sad situation. The Denver Post and the San Jose Mercury News, owned by Digital First, once great major metropolitan newspapers, now have smaller newsrooms than the Boston Herald. But stay tuned, Digital First now owns the Boston Herald, so it's kind of clear where that's going.
Oh boy, I mean, it's a troubling scenario, especially for the future of journalism and what do you tell your journalist students?
Well, what I tell them is that there will always be opportunities, but a lot of them are finding opportunities in new forms of media, which I think is fine. I mean, we have students at BuzzFeed and Politico and a variety of other types of ventures, and some of them do have traditional newspaper jobs, and some of them are at the Washington Post, which is growing.
Sure. Melissa, how about yourself? You were a teacher. You have classes, your students. You're a writer. You're an author. You kind of have a new book coming out, which maybe talk a little bit about that. But what do you see in your classroom? What do you have coming up?
Well, what I would say I see in my classroom or in teaching about news and fake news and in working on this fake news book project, which brings together 30 different authors from various academic disciplines, some journalists, some comms, psychology, political science, is that what we're dealing with is kind of a perfect storm of issues. And so I think through this discussion, we've actually talked about a lot of them. And my approach to teaching is the same way. And it's that we can't really understand what's happening in contemporary journalism without thinking in shifts in technology and how Google and Facebook eat up all of the new advertising revenue growth. We can't think about these things without thinking about alternative funding models, nonprofit or philanthropic initiatives. We can't think about these things without considering policy, potentially holding Google and Facebook accountable as publishers of information, not just neutral platforms. And we can't think about all these issues without addressing some of the cultural and political schisms that are currently happening. And this can be tricky with students because I want to reach them and they exist across the political spectrum and have very different backgrounds and approaches to understanding this. And I think ultimately until we really start thinking about all of these different spheres as mutually constitutive and overlapping, we're not really going to get very far. And so I think that's really what I've learned in piecing all of this together is we have to think about fake news as part of this system, information ecosystem that is beyond just news itself.
Now, Melissa, you mentioned Facebook and Google. They've become so massive and so dominant in the online media. It almost reminds me of like the turn of the 20th century, the big trusts, like when the Rockefellers had a monopoly on oil, and then you had the Antitrust Act, and it was busted up into 7 companies. I almost think that this is an analogous situation today with Facebook and Google. It's almost a situation where, you need like a Teddy Roosevelt type to come in and bust the thing up. It's become so huge and so powerful and so much of a concentration of not just money, but also media power that it has a potential of controlling conversation, controlling communication. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we're seeing, the U.S. government approve these huge mergers again that are most definitely, anti-competitive in nature with, AT&T and Time Warner, et cetera. And I do think it is a huge problem because it will further, I think, exacerbate some of these issues with an emphasis on profit margins rather than like serving the public good with what you're reporting on. Right. And so I'm actually surprised to hear you say that you're pro breaking up these companies.
Yes. Because I think you need to bring back competition, and because it's a dangerous phenomenon, especially in the area of communication. If you have one group controlling the means of communication, it's sort of like the in the 1960s when you had just the big three, Now we have multiple networks, and I think that's been healthy for discussion. So it's in that sense that you want to loosen the forces of competition in the free market. But anyway, I want to thank you both for joining me this afternoon. Melissa Zimdars, thank you very much. Dan Kennedy, it's been a pleasure as always.
Thank you, Chuck.
All right. Thank you very much, and I shall return tomorrow at 12 noon. Have a good day, everybody.